whether a person believes in God, whether or not God even exists, the idea of God, the concepts of God become such an important part of so many people's lives that they change that person's brain.
My name is Rabbi Yitzchak Schochet from London, England, the rabbi of the Mill Hill Synagogue, writer, broadcaster, and international lecturer.
I'm Dr. Andrew Newberg. I'm the Director of Research at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, and the author of How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain and How God Changes Your Brain.
You have written extensively on the theme of enlightenment and God and how that impacts on one's psyche, etc. So let's begin. Let's go straight into perhaps you explaining what is enlightenment and why have you dedicated so many years to studying it?
Enlightenment can be different things for different people. In fact, ultimately, we talk about enlightenment, especially the big E experiences, as being the most profound type of spiritual experience that affects a person and transforms their entire life, their entire way of thinking about reality, and their entire sense of the religious and spiritual as well. Many of us have had the small E enlightenment experiences, which at least give us a taste of that. It's those aha moments that people have that help us to understand something new, some new aspect of our lives. But ultimately, the reason that I have been so interested in studying it is that these profound experiences give us a glimpse of the most important spiritual aspects of a human person's life and tell us something about the nature of reality as well, because it's within those experiences that people feel that they have this new sense of clarity and understanding and sense of reality, realness of the world, which to me is fundamentally important for us to understand what to me is the truly big question of what is real and how do we get there.
So what was the turning point? At what point did you decide suddenly to go in that direction?
Well, on one hand, I have always been interested in some of these fundamental questions. I was always very worried or concerned about the fact that, how could we all live in the same world and yet some people are one religion, some people are another, some people are Republican and Democrat and so forth. Why don't we all have the same conclusions? And I realized early on that the fundamental question was, so what's reality? How do we actually know what reality is? And I started by thinking, well, it must have something to do with our brain. How does our brain help us to take in information and tell us something about the world around us? So I studied the brain a lot. But as I went through my training, as I went through my education, I began to realize that looking at the brain only and only looking at the scientific perspective does leave out certain things that are very important, especially when it comes to our consciousness and our subjective experience of reality. So then I started to look at different philosophical traditions, different religious and spiritual traditions, theology and so forth. And all of these ideas were kind of swirling around in my own mind as I got into medical school, and had the incredible good fortune of meeting two wonderful mentors, one who helped me to look at the brain and using brain imaging and some of these incredible techniques to try to figure out how our brain works. And the other was a psychiatrist and anthropologist who had been also exploring where does religion and spirituality come from in the context of the brain? How does our brain engage our religious and spiritual ideas? And as we were kind of doing all of that, at one point the proverbial light bulb went off, and I said, well, if we're using brain scans to study Alzheimer's disease and depression, then why can't we use them to study religion and spirituality? And that was what in many ways launched at least my entree into the whole field of neurotheology and trying to understand what that relationship is between the brain and our religious and spiritual selves, and how we can bring both sides of this conversation together to help us understand the true nature of reality.
So you talk about spiritual selves. Do you think that experiencing enlightenment or spiritual awakening these days is something that seems to occur a lot more than ever before?
It certainly occurs quite often. We've run surveys of people's most intense spiritual experiences, enlightenment experiences, and they happen a lot. And they have, it's hard to get a true sense of the actual number and whether it's actually happening more or less. And these are important questions for us to try to ultimately get at. But part of what, to me, was one of the real take-home messages of the data that we got from about 2,000 people who talked about these enlightenment kinds of experiences is that they really can happen to anyone, and they can happen to everyone. I mean, it was not that they had to be some mystic, sitting on a mountainside somewhere. It didn't have to be a rabbi. It didn't have to be a priest. It happened to just everyday people, and sometimes they were in pursuit of something spiritual, in pursuit of enlightenment. Sometimes they were just walking down the street. And so to me, that is where it really becomes quite fascinating to try to understand how all of these experiences are related to each other, and can that tell us something about the nature of those experiences, and even give us some ideas and directions to help people to find that spiritual path towards enlightenment.
So when we use terms like enlightenment or spirituality, I guess it begs the bigger question: what part of enlightenment is essentially divine and what is not?
Well, and that's, to me, in this context of this field of study called neurotheology, which really seeks to understand the relationship between science and religion, it doesn't really give priority to one or the other. And so in at least my study of these experiences, to me, I have to be open to both sides of that discussion, and whether or not these experiences purely come from God, whether they come from our brain, whether there's some combination. I suspect ultimately there's some combination, because on one hand, even if God is somehow communicating directly with us or with an individual in some way, it's the brain that helps that person figure out what it means and how it changes their behaviors and the thoughts and the feelings that they have. By the same token, if we go outside and we take a look at an automobile, the automobile exists, but it's our brain that's ultimately creating the image of that automobile in our mind and helps us to assess what it is and whether it's a part of reality or not. So I think ultimately there's going to be some very challenging and fundamentally interesting questions, both from the brain side as well as the philosophy and theology side, about whether or not the nature of these experiences are ultimately something that is natural, supernatural, or some combination of the two.
And yet the title of one of your books is How God Changes Your Brain. God, right? So begging the question, to what extent does God feature in the equation? Does this happen whether or not we believe in God?
Well, and that's, I think, part of our point, which is that whether a person believes in God, whether or not God even exists, the idea of God, the concepts of God become such an important part of so many people's lives that they change that person's brain. And so now obviously there may be God who actually is having that direct influence on people. And often, again, it has to do with how that particular person looks at the idea of God, what they think God is asking them to do, guiding them to do in certain ways, what types of traditions, beliefs, and so forth that individual decides to hold, and how they decide to manifest that in their behaviors. Do they decide to become charitable and altruistic? Do they decide to become militant and aggressive towards people who don't believe the same way? And to me, again, these are some really interesting questions for us to think about from this neurotheological perspective of, what exactly is going on, and can we actually try to even answer that big question of, to me, I've always sort of thought about, as we've done brain scans of people engaged in prayer practices and meditation and so forth, that if somebody said, I had the most incredible spiritual experience, and we look into the brain and nothing has changed, maybe we really have found something that goes beyond the brain and goes beyond the spiritual. And on the other hand, again, I think to me, this epistemological question about the nature of reality, part of what is so fundamentally important of looking at these kinds of experiences, it is that when people have this kind of enlightenment experience, some kind of mystical experience, they do perceive that they get beyond the physical world, and they do perceive something that lies beyond, and whether it is a universal consciousness, whether it is God, depending on the tradition, depending on how the person defines it. Again, that to me, you're trying to look at those experiences and understand them and try to reflect on what they mean, I think is the best way to try to get at that answer to that question.
Do you think that there are some people that may be more prone to seeking or experiencing enlightenment than others?
Well, I think everyone has a spiritual side, and especially if you define that very broadly. I mean, certainly for some people who do not follow a given religious tradition, sometimes, I've had many people come up to me when I give presentations and they'll say, well, my spirituality is my creativity, it's my music, it's art, it's being in nature. Even for a scientist, it can just be the engagement of trying to understand the natural world. So ultimately, we're all trying to find that connection. We're all trying to connect to ourselves, more really and more authentically, and how we connect with the world around us in a more effective way. How we try to get beyond just ourselves and connect with something greater. But so for many people, that does take a very traditional religious perspective, and I think that there are, if you look around the world, while there is the rise of the people who say I'm spiritual but not religious, there's certainly billions of people who are religious themselves, and so we are all seeking information. We're all seeking to understand ourselves. We're all seeking to understand the world. Some of us do go about it in a more formal way, and some have this notion of a goal of truly striving for enlightenment, for a new way of looking at the world, a new paradigm, a new understanding. And for those people who can try to get there, I hope that, one, they're able to do that, and I hope that these kinds of experiences actually can kind of come back to the rest of the world and try to bring us to a better way of looking at things. There's so much strife and conflict throughout the world. What's I think is a hopeful aspect of these experiences is the sense of connecting humanity and trying to find the common ground that we share, as opposed to finding all the different ways in which we're different. So I hope that we can do that.
So the way I would actually interpret this, obviously as a rabbi, as an observant Jew, is that to all intent and purposes, what you're really saying is that we are hardwired for God. Begging then the question, if that is the case, why do so many people look to almost deliberately push God out of the picture?
Well, I think that so much of what each one of us believes is based on so many different factors. It starts with our genes and how we look at the world, and some people look at the world more analytically, some people look at the world more emotionally, some people look at the world more optimistically, more pessimistically, and some of that's the way we're wired. But then you have how our parents bring us up, how our friends are, how our teachers are, and all the interactions that we have, and the experiences. Do we lose a loved one? Do we, have close relationships, bad relationships? And then it all leads us to wherever we are in that moment. And so, on one hand, it never surprises me that we all have a unique perspective and a unique belief about what reality is. It doesn't surprise me that one person finds Judaism, one person finds Christianity, and somebody else becomes agnostic or atheist. But I think that, again, there's always that search for the answer to those questions, and that's the common piece, and that's ultimately what we're kind of talking about in that notion of, are we hardwired for God? Are we hardwired for spirituality? We're all striving for that greater connection, and whether we how we find that is where the differences lie. And I think an important question then also is, when people talk about these different kinds of experiences. When people have an enlightenment experience and someone says, I felt connected to God, somebody else says, I felt an incredible sense of love, I felt a power, I felt a force, I felt consciousness. Are they the same experiences, or are they fundamentally different? And that in and of itself, again, from a brain perspective as well as from a philosophical perspective, to me is very interesting and very important for us to look at, to see where those distinctions are, where the similarities are, and where the differences are. But I do think that ultimately, we are all capable of those kinds of experiences. We're all capable of making that kind of connection. But exactly how we do it and what are the factors that may prevent one person from finding it and facilitate another person, that depends on all the things that have brought us to that particular moment.
So really what you're saying is that when we ask about, or we talk about how God changes one's brain, that would happen whether or not we believe in him.
It certainly could happen whether or not we believe in God. And again, in our survey, I was very struck by some of the experiences where people said, well, I wasn't really looking for anything. I was never really believed very much. I was driving my truck down the street, and suddenly, I saw the world in a completely different way, and I understood the notion of God and the relationship of God to myself and God to the world. So, while we don't necessarily have to believe in God, it seems that these experiences can even find individuals who don't. Obviously, as a general statement, it's probably a more likely thing for somebody to achieve an enlightenment kind of experience or some profound spiritual experience when they are looking for that, when they are trying to find it through a particular tradition, when they're, or even just in their own mind. and their own consciousness, trying to figure that out. But again, to me, the exciting aspect of what neurotheology is all about is asking people these questions. What are you striving for? What are you looking for? What do you believe? And then how does all of that relate to, and interrelate to each other? And then how does that have something to do with what's going on in the brain of that person as well? And it gets back to answering your question: is it, that the people who find God have the most dopamine, or is it just that those are the people who are searching, or does God really, have some divine plan that God decides that some people are worth giving that experience to, or need to have that experience given to, and other people need to continue to struggle in different ways? This is where the theology and the religious part is just as essential as whatever's going on biologically.
Right. So let's take the leap from there into meditation and prayer. How do scientific and religious opinions differ actually when it comes to meditation?
Well, I think what the most obvious differentiation has to do with whether or not meditation or prayer are kind of looked at on a more biological level or a more spiritual level. And this spills over even into the more health-related aspects. When people have looked at meditation and yoga programs, they tend to look at that as on a more secular level. They want to make it available regardless of what your particular tradition is. So mindfulness, for example, it derives from Buddhist perspectives, but whether you're Jewish or Christian or Muslim or whatever, it's designed in certain ways that it can be used irrespective of whatever your particular background is. So I think scientists tend to look at it more from a health perspective and more from a biological perspective. Obviously, on the religious side, prayer and meditation are fundamentally spiritual practices, and they are ways of connecting that individual to God. They're the ways of connecting that individual to the tradition. And in some of the early work that I did with some of my colleagues, we talked a lot about the value of these practices, particularly in the context of rituals. And rituals are so powerful, as are practices like meditation and prayer, because of the rhythmicity of them, the repetitive aspect of it. And that makes sense from the brain's perspective as well. The more we do anything, the more our brain becomes used to it, the more that becomes ingrained, it becomes hardwired into the brain. And so, especially even, particularly I always think about, in the Jewish tradition, which is my tradition as well, things like the Passover Seder, of all the rituals that occur within the Seder, but then, how that's passed on across families, across generations. And so you can see how these kinds of practices from a religious perspective have an incredible value, not just for that person, but in binding the person all the way across, through the tradition, across the generations. And that to me makes it a very powerful kind of experience for people to have.
So pushing more on this point, increasingly medical scientists are looking at the benefits of a religious lifestyle for people's well-being and the role of spirituality in their recovery, in fact, even from illness. And many point to the efficacy of prayer in helping recuperation from illness. I think the most famous experiment was undertaken by a Dr. Randolph Bird, a cardiologist, right, at the University of California, where in a double-blind test of over 300 heart attack victims, half of those were prayed for by other people without either the patient knowing or the people who are praying knowing who they were praying for. And among the prayed for sample, the results were astounding. Fewer deaths, faster recovery, fewer potent medicines required for their recuperation. How do we explain that?
The studies of intercessory prayer are fascinating and are very important for us to look at. Again, that to me is another side of what neurotheology is about. How do we try to understand what those studies, and there are many, and some have shown those kinds of remarkable effects, others less so, and it raises even more questions. What exactly is going on? And even if we assume that the study was done perfectly well and the results are absolutely what they were, does that mean that somebody prayed up to God and then God went specifically to intervene? Did it have something to do with human consciousness? Are there other energies, forces that are going on that we don't know about or have a challenge actually measuring with science? So, I think, to me, I published a book called Principles of Neurotheology, and in there I talk about that we have to go beyond just kind of what we know scientifically right now. It doesn't mean we give that up. I mean, obviously science is fundamental, but and fundamentally important, but there may be new ways of looking at things that we haven't thought of before, and we certainly have to think about what could be going on in the brain, and whether or not it is a purely religious phenomena or whether there is something biological that's happening. And of course, if you get into the weeds of these intercessory prayer studies, they raise other really interesting questions about, well, is it better that the person that you're praying for? If you're praying for your parent, your mother or your father, is that different than having somebody who's never prayed for them pray for them? Is it more important to have 10 people praying for somebody versus 5 people? Is it, does it depend on how religious those individuals are? Does it matter what tradition, if you're a Jewish person praying for a Muslim, is that different than if you're a Jewish praying for a Jewish person? So, there get to be many, many kinds of fascinating questions. Obviously, we need to be appropriately skeptical, and I think what's important about skepticism is that it also needs to be constructive and optimistic as well. So it's good to be critical and to think through what these studies may mean, but it's also important to be open to them. And there are many other studies that have looked at the effects of human consciousness on other life and even non-living things like random number generators and things like that. So there's a lot of evidence out there that we need to take a good look at and to try to understand what the biological effects may ultimately be.
So I'm going to put to you a mystical theory, which of course is not scientific per se, but welcome your thoughts on it. The quote from the Zohar, who tells us that we find this interesting idea of how a person's state of mind generates a corresponding reaction in heaven, if you will. A person's, say, joy and happiness will generate joy and happiness from above, which in turn will then descend upon him. Or in other words, the interaction between mind and body also reflects the reciprocal interaction between heaven and earth. So man's faith or trust in God and his prayers are like rays of light, if you will, that are sent upward to hit a mirror, which then bounce back down to the lights of blessing or redemption or salvation for the particular individual.
I think one of the really important aspects of what, to me, neurotheology is as a field is that we need to take very seriously the various spiritual and religious interpretations about just how the world works and how our minds work and what's going on in the world. So the idea that, through the Zohar, there's this notion of our energy and our spirit sort of going somewhere and then having an effect elsewhere. I think that we need to take that seriously. We need to look into it, and we need to see whether or not that does make some sense. And again, it brings up some interesting questions about, is it directable? Can I direct it towards you, or is it just that it kind of inundates the world? There have been some very interesting studies of people going into a city and having 1,000 people meditate, and then they find that the crime rates decrease. So is that again a more generalized effect, or how specific could it potentially be? And but I think that's why, to me, it's so important for us to look at what various traditions have said about the nature of consciousness, about how the world works, how whether the natural world and some kind of supernatural aspects. To me, there's just the universe and the world. So however it works, there must be an explanation, and that, to me, is why I feel it's so valuable to bring in what we can look at scientifically, but what we also have the ability to look at from a religious or spiritual perspective as well.
So what would you say to somebody who argues that prayer is just a crutch?
Well, I just sort of take, again...
Sorry, and if I can expand on that.
That's okay.
No, within that question,
yeah.
Can non-believers pray as well then?
I think that one of the things that is important for people to realize, and we've shown this in our studies, and there's been some other studies as well, is that certainly religion and spirituality can be an important coping mechanism for people, and in that context it can be a kind of crutch for them to help them. Some people turn to their religion and spiritual beliefs as more specifically for that. But what the data also seems to show is that On one hand, somebody who is a non-believer, who's an atheist, if you said, well, you should try this meditation, they're likely to derive some benefit from doing some of these things. But what the data has been showing to us is that when it's something that does have personal meaning to you, when you quote unquote buy into it, then it goes up manyfold. And so just saying a prayer or just doing a bit of a meditation, especially when you don't really care that much about it, it might lower your blood pressure and it might make you feel a little relaxed for a few minutes. But when you're doing something that you have a deep sense of value to, that it provides you a sense of meaning and purpose, it provides you a powerful emotional response, then that's going to cause a lot of different changes in your brain and ultimately in your body. And so, especially when you think about the relationship between religion and health, while the intercessory prayer studies are interesting, they capture this one very unique element of religion. Certainly, I think many doctors realize the value of meditation and prayer for the person. And so for people who are going into surgery, who are dealing with cancer, who are dealing with heart disease, doing these kinds of practices can be extraordinarily valuable for people in reducing their stress and allowing them to tolerate treatments better. There's been evidence to show that it reduces, that these practices reduce stress hormones, that they may even improve the immune system in terms of how it functions. So, when there are many different ways for us to think about this overall interaction, both in terms of physical health as well as mental health. And that to me, again, is a very important area for us to look at, as well as the times where it doesn't go so well. When people do wind up kind of looking at religion in a negative way, where they got cancer, some people turn towards God and say, well, God is going to help me through my cancer. Other people say, why did God give me cancer? I reject God. Why is God making me suffer? And in my way of thinking, I say, well, what's the difference in the brain of those two different kinds of people?
So we're living in a very fragmented world today, and the younger generation seem to be so far adrift. I guess the question is simply, to your mind, how can we inspire the next generation, particularly the younger generation, to get, shall we say, more in touch with their spiritual selves?
Well, I think an important answer to that question, which is something that I do think is always excited me about this whole field of research of neurotheology, is that we have to reach to where people are. And so, just taking the example of my own background of making presentations, when I go to talk to a group of psychiatrists versus if I go to talk to a group of rabbis, it's a different conversation. I have to, I have to work with where people are starting. And I think with for example, the younger population and the younger generation, obviously there's a great reliance on technology and so forth, and I think finding ways of trying to help them engage their own religious and spiritual ideas through the things that they're familiar with, to try to take advantage of the social media and that. I think that in and of itself could be a very powerful way of helping the younger population kind of reconnect with traditions and to see what's important and valuable and how they can find ways of making it a part of their lives. I think ultimately what happens is that people feel like it doesn't have value. It doesn't change the way they think about things. Well, the evidence shows that it does, and trying to bring that evidence to them, trying to show them how to re-engage, to help them to figure out the traditions and the practices that might be the most useful for them. Also, to me, becomes very important. If you come from a Jewish background, then I'm probably not going to suggest that you become, Hindu. We say, well, gee, you have this wonderful background that you can turn to. And then, of course, there are some people who do need to move away from their own tradition because of issues, problems, between with their family, abuse, whatever. So, part of what we have to find is how do we best reach to each person, and especially into these younger generations, to try to help them to find out where they are now, help them to see the potential value of engaging the spiritual side of who they are, the importance of that, and maybe even getting them away from some of the social media and away from the technology and a little bit back to the people that they deal with and the world around them that becomes so valuable to us in terms of how we think about ourselves and our relation to reality, to the universe around us.
And how would a person know if they're actually having a spiritual experience or a psychotic episode?
Well, Again, a great question for us to think about from a neurotheological perspective is, what is normal? What is appropriate for people to have? Part of the answer to the question is that it has a lot to do with what that person thinks. Did they feel it was a real experience? Did they feel it was transformative? Did they feel it was beneficial? From a very pragmatic perspective, we look at the results and we look at the practical side of things. Did it change them did it bring them into being somebody who operates in society well, engages society well, becomes successful, and I don't mean financially, but becomes a good person and has good relationships and so forth? Or is it somebody who really can't function in society because they have an issue or problem, a disorder that doesn't enable them to be the kind of person that they ultimately can benefit from being? So I think a lot of it has to do with the adaptiveness of those experiences, but it raises fascinating questions when we look at these Enlightenment experiences. We do see certain interesting examples of them when people have disorders, when people have schizophrenia. We know of people who claim to be the Messiah, and I personally had one person claiming to be a reincarnated King David, which I thought was at least original. But what does that mean? How do we understand that for that particular person? So those are important. That's one piece of this larger puzzle. People who have these unusual experiences, spiritual experiences under the influence of different psychedelic compounds. People report these experiences to be highly spiritual. And in some of our data, where we've looked at the surveys and the descriptions of these experiences, they match a lot of the criteria about what is spiritual, the realness, the clarity, the intensity of these experiences. But obviously they occur under different circumstances. And so what do we take from that? Biologically, we say, oh, well, they took this drug, so it was created by the drug. If you go to shamanic cultures around the world, that's just the doorway to the spiritual world. It's just bringing the brain up to another level that they can see the world in a different way. To me, the analogy is, when I put on my glasses, before I do that, the world's very blurry. I put on the glasses, the world didn't change, but I see the world clearer now. So there's those kinds of experiences. There are the experiences that happen through meditation and prayer, the more traditional routes that people take. And I think trying to compare and explore them across all of these different ways in which these experiences happen also is a very valuable tool for us to look at, so that we can help people try to understand, was this experience something that was a real experience, a good experience, one that wasn't abnormal, and again, a lot of it does come to how do we define things as abnormal, and I've always liked to say, you could theoretically have an otherwise normal person have a very abnormal experience. You could have an abnormal, a schizophrenic patient who has a very normal religious experience, and all the different permutations about that. But that leads also back to the whole notion of health and well-being, so that, how do we try to help people to learn about what their experiences are, incorporate them adaptively into their lives, and hopefully, help people to use that enlightenment experience to get to that state of enlightenment where they can hopefully contribute both positively to themselves as well as to the larger community around the world.
Okay, finally,
yes.
When you come up to heaven, what's the first thing you'd like to ask God?
Well, my real question, which has been the driving question throughout my entire life and career, is what's real? What is the real reality? And I would love to know the answer to that question.
Hopefully, you won't have to find it other than down here for a long time coming.
That's my hope. And again, from my perspective, I feel like, science is wonderful and it guides us down, learning about the natural world. Religion and spirituality is wonderful and gives us that perspective. I feel that somewhere the mixture of them, and I don't know what that means exactly, but as I always say, if I ever figure it out, I will certainly let everyone know.
Fair enough. Dr. Newberg, thank you so very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.